The fasten your seatbelt light turns on above your head. You knew this was going to be a short flight, but it feels like you just got in the air. The flight attendants have barely just finished serving drinks, but it must be time to land already. Wrapping the straps around your waist, click the buckle into place. You wait to touch down in tropical paradise. Without warning, a loud bang is followed by a sudden whoosh of air that feels like it would have pulled you right out of your seat if you didn't have your seatbelt on. Then, howling wind blasts you into the back of the chair as the screams of passengers erupt around you. When your eyes adjust to the light, you are greeted by a horrifying sight, a bright blue abyss. For one Aloha Airlines Boeing 737, April 28, 1988, started out as routine as a day could be. As usual, it was scheduled for a series of short inter-island flights across Hawaii. With no notable issues reported after a series of visual inspections, the plane departed from Honolulu in Oahu for back-to-back round trips to Hilo, Maui, and Kauai. The plane then traveled to Maui and Hilo. The next destination was back to Honolulu. By 1:25 p.m., the Boeing had done 8 trips, and the crew was getting ready for a scheduled first office switchover, having Madeline Tompkins join pilot Robert Schornsteimer on board for their next flight from Hilo to Honolulu. Aboard Flight 243 were 3 flight attendants and 89 passengers. They anticipated the short trip would be just like the last, and as they smoothly ascended into the air, it seemed as though they would be right. With an expected flight duration of only 45 minutes, the attendants on duty, Michelle Honda, Clarabelle Lansing, and Jane Sato Tomita, would just barely have enough time to serve drinks. So as soon as the plane reached its cruising altitude of 24,000 feet, they quickly got to work. The crew was seasoned, with 55-year-old Clarabelle having worked as a flight attendant for 37 years and Michelle with 14 years of experience. Just a short while later, it was already halfway through the flight. William and Joy Flanagan, sitting in the 5th row, were giddy, en route to celebrate their 21st wedding anniversary. Jane and Clarabelle approached the happy couple, pushing the refreshment cart between them and let them know it was last call for drinks, as they would be landing soon. Handing Joy her drink, Jane's fingers briefly brushed with Joy's as she received the plastic cup. Then, chaos erupted. Joy felt a jolt as her head was flung down into the table tray in front of her. Both Jane and Clarabelle, standing there just a moment ago, had disappeared. To her side, a vast open sky. The window next to her head was gone. Pieces of metal scraped Joy's face as they flew by. William held on to his bleeding wife, terrified that she would be swept away by the wind. Even as crackling wires, freed from the plane's frame, burned his arms, he refused to let go, and believing that they were going to crash, he professed his love to Joy for what he thought could be the last time. Eric Becklin, who was sitting 3 seats from the back of the plane, got a better view of what had just happened. All of a sudden, I heard a loud noise, a bang, but not an explosion, and felt a strong pressure change. I looked up front and saw the front of the top left of the airplane disintegrating, just going apart, pieces of it flying away. It started with a hole about a yard wide, and it just kept coming apart. The sudden pressure difference had sucked everything nearby that wasn't fastened down out through the gaping hole in the ceiling. Thankfully, the passengers were held tightly by their seatbelts and weren't thrown into the abyss. Michelle, who had been knocked on her back by a jolt of wind, watched debris fly through the blue sky above her as the ceiling tore to pieces. Gathering her wits as the wind pressed onto her face, she looked around for her fellow attendants. Further down the aisle, Jane had been hit by the cockpit door and was covered in fallen debris, bleeding from her head and seemed to be knocked unconscious. But Clarabelle was nowhere to be seen. With Jane incapacitated and Clarabelle missing, Michelle knew it was up to her to find out what was going on, but she needed to act fast. She managed to make her way to the back of the plane, keeping her breath low, where she attempted to contact the pilot through the intercom. No answer. The communications wiring had been severed, and that wasn't the only thing that had been lost. The first 5 rows of the plane were now completely exposed to the sky. The ceiling and walls of that section of the plane had been completely ripped off, leaving the plane's nose attached only by the floor beams, which buckled under the strain. The panels on top of first class took with it the oxygen masks and tubing system critical to distribute oxygen to the rest of the aircraft. So now, even though the plane was depressurized and the initial threat of getting sucked out of the plane through the gaping hole was over, due to the lack of oxygen in high altitude, the passengers were still at risk. The plane, hurtling through the sky at 500 kilometers an hour, needed to descend immediately. But with comms out of order and a large pile of debris now blocking Michelle's view of the cockpit, she had no way of knowing whether the pilots were alive, let alone even in the plane. which made it all the more terrifying when all of a sudden, the plane began to feel like it was dropping out of the sky. In desperation, Michelle began dragging herself forward along the aisle. She stayed low and held onto the retainer bars below the seats, making sure not to get blown out of the plane as she went row by row, comforting the terrified passengers, coaxing them into putting their life jackets on, and asking if anyone knew how to fly a plane. When oxygen masks deploy in the cockpit of a plane, that's usually a pretty good sign that something has gone wrong. But for Captain Robert Schornsteimer and First Officer Madeline Tompkins, that wasn't the main cause for alarm. It was the flight deck door being ripped off its hinges, and the fact that when they looked back over to the debris behind them, all they could see was blue sky, where the first-class cabin ceiling should have been. Unable to make contact with the rest of the crew, they had no way of knowing if anyone else on the plane had survived the blast. All they knew was that if anyone was still alive, they wouldn't stay that way for very long at this altitude without oxygen. The best they could do to help anyone on this plane was to land it. Officer Tompkins desperately attempted to contact air traffic control as Captain Schornsteimer took the controls and pitched the aircraft into an emergency descent at a stomach-dropping 1,200 meters per minute. The pilots, losing no focus, had no time to check on the passengers or concern themselves with what had happened to the plane and why it had a gaping hole in its roof. It wouldn't be determined until investigators later analyzed the wreckage that all of this was caused by a tiny, near-invisible crack. I say nearly because part of it was actually noticed by a passenger, Gail Yamamoto. In an interview after the incident, Gail said she had seen something while boarding the plane, a tiny, barely visible crack on the side of the hull near the door. But she assumed the flight crew were already aware and didn't want to make a fuss and appear as a nervous passenger, so instead of speaking out, she got on the plane and she took her seat. But how did this crack form, and why did it go unnoticed by safety inspection personnel? Well, airplanes are built from separate panels that overlap and are bonded together by epoxy adhesive. Rivets are bolted into the panels to hold them together as the epoxy sets. These metal panels are designed to expand with altitude and contract on descent. Due to the nature of the pressure changes these panels can take over their life cycle, planes have to be retired after a certain number of flights. In this case, this Boeing model was designed for a 20-year service life and to last 75,000 flights. However, while the specific Boeing 737 involved in the incident was only 19 years old, it had gone through the pressurized-depressurized cycle for short flights in quick succession, constantly, repeatedly stressing its panels, completing nearly 90,000 flights over its lifetime, which is many more than its suggested limit. This caused the structure of the fuselage to weaken. Think of it like bending a paperclip back and forth many times. Eventually, it breaks. Jim Widley, investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board, inspected samples of the fuselage in his lab. Beside the rivet holes, he noticed hairline cracks that had formed. These small cracks, hidden beneath the painted surface along the upper parts of the fuselage, were nearly impossible to detect during visual inspections, especially when the inspections were done at night under artificial lighting and when workers were least alert, like what Aloha Airlines was unfortunately often ought to do. The investigation also revealed that the epoxy might have not been applied at the correct temperature during the assembly of the plane, causing the rivets to become disbonded. All of this, with the additional wear and tear on the plane caused by Hawaii's high humidity and salt-laden air, might have contributed to the corrosion of the bond between the fuselage panels, causing the explosive decompression. But the incident could have been a lot worse. Had the damage been on the bottom half, for example, the plane could have split in two. Thankfully, the plane was still able to fly, even with part of its roof gone, for now at least. Back in the cockpit, Officer Tompkins attempted to contact Honolulu Air Traffic Control Center, only to be met with static. Then, 3 minutes into the incident, their Mayday call was answered by the tower for Kahului Airport in Maui. Kahului Airport was indeed the closest destination they could make an emergency landing at, but situated between two volcanic mountains and an ocean, they would have to navigate carefully through the windy corridor between high ground and safety. With the plane's structure compromised, making the turn would be extremely risky. The pilot, steering the plane manually, was also feeling like the hydraulic system was failing and decided to deploy the landing gear ahead of time. But this posed another challenge. While the left and right wheels clicked into place, the control panel light for the nose wheel wouldn't turn on. The pilots had no way of knowing whether the issue was due to a faulty panel or the landing gear itself, and without a nose wheel they would most certainly crash upon landing. but they would have to take the risk and hope that they actually had a nose wheel. Meanwhile, the ground team had to work fast to figure out the extent of the emergency and how much backup they would need. If a crash landing was inevitable and the nose touched the runway, the whole airplane was under risk of breaking apart, including the fuel tanks, potentially causing a catastrophic explosion. But as the plane approached the runway, they spotted it. The nose gear of the plane was visible. However, neither the tower nor the cabin crew had any way of knowing if it had clicked in place properly. Still, they would have to chance it, praying that the front wheel would hold during landing. With nothing else left to do but try to land as smoothly as possible, Captain Schornsteimer initiated the descent, clutching onto the control column. The plane was swerving so much that getting control over the plane took immense focus, and he had made the decision that having control of the plane was more important than slowing it down to the regular landing speed of 282 kilometers per hour. The plane descended, coming in hot at 320 kilometers an hour. Passengers, who had an idea that the pilots were still active after the plane had continued flying in a controlled manner, braced themselves in their seats. The nose gear held firm as Aloha Flight 243 touched ground, finally landing safely 13 minutes after the incident began. And while there were injuries among the passengers, the incident was resolved with only one casualty. Clarabelle was never found. The flight attendant's body was sucked out from the aircraft and disappeared along with the missing debris from the plane. Search and recovery efforts were unsuccessful. Many people are afraid of flying, and frankly, so many things can go wrong in the sky. Aloha Flight 243 managed to land safely after the ordeal, with 65 people on board injured, 8 of them seriously. The small airport's ground response team was totally unprepared for the people needing immediate treatment. There weren't enough ambulances, so victims ended up being ferried in tour company vehicles. However, every time there is a plane incident, aviation safety experts try finding a way to implement better strategies to prevent the same issues from happening again. As a result of the Aloha Flight 243 incident, safety protocols changed. Thorough inspections for aircraft cracks around rivets became more standardized to prevent a similar accident from happening again. Hazel Courtney, president of the International Federation of Airworthiness, said that the incident sparked significant attention to aging aircraft and how they were managed. So, should you still be worried? According to a 2017 Harvard University study, the odds that your plane would get into a crash is 1 in 1.2 million. And even if you are involved in an aviation accident, you are likely to survive it. Odds of a fatality is 1 in 11 million. A U.S. National Transportation Safety Board review of national aviation accidents found that more than 95% of aircraft occupants survived accidents from 1983 to 1999. And a more recent report from the BBC in 2018 analyzed the most serious aviation incidents, reporting a survival rate of 55%. In any case, personally, I'll be keeping both my feet planted firmly on solid ground. But if you decide to travel on a plane, make sure to keep your seatbelt fastened while you're in your seat. At the end of the day, that little annoying seatbelt was the literal lifeline for the passengers who went through the ordeal on Aloha Airlines Flight 243. And if you'd like to find out what other seemingly innocuous things could mean the difference between life and a tragic, terrifying death, then subscribe to our channel. You have no idea how much your one sub really does help us. Hit the bell icon to make sure you're notified when we upload another video. But until then, we have plenty more videos to watch, like this one about the starving passengers who, after trying and failing to eat parts of the plane, were forced to eat their friends and loved ones to survive.